Hello and welcome. Today, we will be discussing a study by Audi et al. Titled Dietary Patterns, Body Mass Index, and Inflammation Pathways to Depression and Mental Health Problems in Adolescents. Mental health disorders are being recognized as one of the most serious global health issues and are seen more frequently among youth in recent years. In 2019, it was estimated that 1 in 7 adolescents experience mental disorders, amounting to 166 million adolescents worldwide. Depression and anxiety have the highest prevalence rates, reaching over 40%. Data shows up to 50% of adult mental health disorders originate before the age of 14 and 75 before 23, marking adolescence as a critical period of development relevant to mental health. This makes research investigating pathways regulating mental health problems during adolescence crucial, as it can help us create effective preventive measures and interventions with the potential to curb the looming mental health epidemic. Previous observational studies had suggested a role of dietary patterns in mental health, seeing as unhealthy dietary patterns were significantly associated with poorer mental health in children and adolescents. However, biologically plausible pathways were not yet tested, and there remains uncertainty about how the bidirectional effect between diet quality and mental health affects this relationship. Emerging data highlights inflammation as a potential major contributor to depression pathophysiology. Significant proportions of people with depression show elevated inflammatory markers such as hsCRP and other cytokines which interact with physiological domains implicated in depression. Furthermore, there has been evidence suggesting chronic inflammation underlies the connection between diet and depression. Inflammatory markers correlate with components of a poorer diet, while healthy diets correlate with reduced inflammation. Elevated inflammation was also seen to be correlated with obesity, as were depressive disorders. Considering these suggested associations, this study aimed to elucidate longitudinal relationships between diet, adiposity, inflammation, and mental health in adolescents. Importantly, this was the first study to show that diet and BMI pathways are linked to inflammation and in turn to mental health disorders in adolescents aged 17 years. This new understanding of these pathways linking diet to mental health are vital for the development of effective early interventions and strategies to combat depression from a young age. In a previously conducted Western Australian pregnancy cohort study, the authors observed positive cross-sectional relationships between a Western dietary pattern and increased BMI with depression. They decided to extend upon these findings in this study, where the same cohort was examined for the pathways linking dietary patterns, energy intake, BMI, and inflammatory markers with depressive symptoms and other mental health problems. They tested the following hypotheses: that dietary patterns and BMI at 14 years predict BMI and inflammatory markers at 17 years, and that inflammation at 17 years predicts depressive symptoms and internalizing and externalizing problems at 17 years. They also tested a reverse hypothesis, that increased levels of depressive symptoms lead to poorer diet, increased BMI, and inflammation.
Now moving on to materials and methods. Firstly, 2,900 women were recruited between 1989 to 1991 to have their child take part in the study. Data was collected from the children at birth 1, 2, 3, 8, 10, and then 14 and 17 years old. However, only data from the follow-ups at 14 and 17 years old were used for analysis during this study. Assessments of food and nutrient intake were assessed at 14 years old, and they were completed using a food frequency questionnaire, also FFQ, which allowed researchers to estimate the serving size and consumption of 212 different foods. After, the researchers identified and labeled them as either Western or healthy. The Western dietary pattern consisted of processed foods, processed meats, full-fat dairy, fried potatoes, refined grains, desserts, soft drinks, chips, sauces, and dressings. The healthy dietary pattern consisted of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, and fish. They also measured the energy and adiposity at 14 years old. At both 14 and 17, the BMI of the adolescents were calculated. At 17 years old, blood samples were obtained to measure leptin and inflammation, specifically the high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, hsCRP. This inflammatory marker is known to be related to depressive symptoms and behavioral problems. Then finally, at 14 and 17 years old, the adolescents were assessed for depressive symptoms using the Beck Depression Inventory for Youth, the BDIY. Then they were assessed for other mental health problems using the Adolescent Youth Self-Report, the YSR. The figure is an overview of the tests conducted at the specific ages.
The main results of this paper show that a Western dietary pattern and higher energy intake were positively associated with body mass index among 14 years old adolescents, and they were also positively associated with body mass index level of leptin and high sensitivity C-reactive protein among 17 years old adolescents. Leptin and high-sensitive C-reactive protein are inflammatory markers that indicate inflammation in the body. Another main result was that higher body mass index at 14 years old was correlated with higher body mass index, higher leptin, and high-sensitive C-reactive protein at 17 years old. This is a full structural equation model for the relationships between 14 years old dietary patterns, 14 years old BMI, 17 years old BMI, and 17 years old inflammation, and 17 years old depressive symptoms. The square boxes are the observed variables and the ellipses are latent constructs. As you can see, the Western diet at 14 years old was significantly and positively associated with BMI, inflammation, and depressive symptoms. The results of depressive symptoms were taken from the Beck Depression Inventory for Youth. This is another full structural equation model, focusing on externalizing problems. As you can see, Western diet at 14 years old was significantly and positively linked with externalizing problems, including thought problems, attentional problems, rule breaking, and aggressive problems. This figure is the reverse hypothesis model, where 14 years old depressive symptoms are considered as a predictor of 14 years old dietary patterns. The results of this model showed that depression at 14 years old did not predict 14 years old dietary patterns, so the reverse pathway was refuted. According to the results, a few statements could be concluded. Mental health problems at 14 years old would be a risk factor for mental health problems at 17 years old. And Western dietary patterns with saturated and trans fatty acids, high GI carbohydrates are significantly associated with inflammation, which may contribute to mental health problems. And also the reverse pathway that depression could be a predictor of dietary patterns was not supported. In conclusion, this study found that a Western dietary pattern indirectly associates with increased obesity and increased chronic inflammation, which then contribute to increased risk of mental health problems, while a healthy dietary pattern associates with less obesity and inflammation, and decreased risk of mental health problems.
Now on to critiques and future directions. Certain critiques of the study were loss of participants. For example, participants with an abnormal dietary intake were excluded prior to analysis. Another critique is the use of self-reports to measure depressive symptoms, which were completed using the BDIY and the YSR. Self-reports could lead to over or under-reporting of depressive symptoms. There also could have been an underreporting with dietary intake, since it's known that overweight individuals tend to underreport their dietary intake. Possible future directions. Possible future directions could focus on clinically diagnosed disorders, as the study did not assess whether individuals in the study were diagnosed with a mental disorder later on. Additionally, the study focused on general dietary patterns, describing them as either Western or healthy. Thus, future studies are required to identify associations between specific diets, down to their food components, with adiposity, inflammation, and mental health. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening. Feel free to ask any questions.